Emily Carter had been the invisible backbone of Maxwell Air Force Base for 8 years. At 34, she possessed something rare in military circles: absolute dedication without the uniform to show for it. While other civilian contractors clocked out at 5 p.m. sharp, Emily volunteered for night shifts, maintaining aircraft systems that others considered good enough. Her small workshop behind Hangar 7 told the story of someone who understood that lives depended on perfection. Every tool had its place, every manual was dog-eared from use, and every piece of equipment, even the officially decommissioned ones, ran like clockwork. The other technicians called her obsessive. Emily called it necessary. "Carter, you're here again?" Staff Sergeant Rodriguez poked his head into her workshop at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. "Don't you have a life outside this place?" Emily looked up from the emergency vehicle she was maintaining at 2018, ambulance truck that had been officially retired 3 years ago due to budget constraints. She'd kept it running with her own money and time, testing every system monthly. "This old girl might save someone's life someday," she said, patting the truck's hood. "Besides, I've got my pilot's license and emergency medical training. If something happens, I want to be ready." Rodriguez shook his head with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You know, Lieutenant Pierce thinks you're overstepping, right? He's been asking questions about why you're maintaining decommissioned equipment." Emily's jaw tightened slightly. Lieutenant Pierce had been making his disapproval known in small ways, cutting her overtime requests, questioning her supply orders, and making pointed comments about civilians who don't understand their place. But she'd dealt with worse. "Let him ask," she said quietly. "I'm not breaking any rules." What Rodriguez didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Emily had been turned down for the rapid response team 4 times in 8 years. Each rejection came with the same explanation: lack of battlefield experience. It stung because she had more emergency training than most of the enlisted medics, but she'd learned to channel that frustration into preparation. The next morning, Emily was finishing her night shift when she heard the radio chatter that would change everything. "Tower, this is Rescue 7. We're coming in hot with wounded. One of our escorts took Small Arms Firetail section is smoking. Requesting emergency landing on runway 3. Through her workshop window, Emily watched the damaged helicopter approach through the morning fog. Even from a distance, she could see the sparks flying from its electrical systems and the dark smoke trailing behind it. Her hands moved automatically to her emergency kit, checking supplies she'd organized and reorganized hundreds of times. Something deep in her chest told her this wasn't going to be a routine landing. "All personnel, this is Lieutenant Pierce. Fuel leak detected on runway 3. Explosion risk is critical. No vehicles authorized to approach. Maintain minimum safe distance." Emily grabbed her binoculars and focused on the landing zone. Her heart stopped. Through the smoke and chaos, she could see a crew member carrying a small figure, a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, unconscious and barely moving. The boy's small body was limp, his skin pale even from this distance. Emily recognized the signs of shock, possibly internal injuries. Every second counted. She looked at her emergency truck, then at the radio crackling with Lieutenant Pierce's orders. For 8 years, she'd followed every rule, respected every protocol, and stayed in her lane. But as she watched that child's life hanging in the balance while everyone else maintained their safe distance, something fundamental shifted inside her. Emily Carter had spent 8 years preparing for this exact moment. She wasn't going to let protocol kill a child. She climbed into her truck and turned the key. "Carter, where do you think you're going?" Lieutenant Pierce's voice cut through the radio static as Emily's emergency truck rolled toward the restricted zone. "There's a child dying out there, sir," Emily responded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm going to help. You are not authorized for emergency response." Stand down immediately. Emily had spent 8 years swallowing her pride, accepting rejection, and staying in her assigned role. But watching that unconscious child through her windshield, she realized some things mattered more than authorization. She turned off her radio. The fuel leak was spreading across the tarmac, creating a rainbow slick that stank of aviation fuel. Emily positioned her truck at the edge of the danger zone, close enough to provide immediate medical care, but angled for quick evacuation if the situation deteriorated. Lieutenant Pierce's voice crackled over the base-wide emergency channel, ensuring everyone could hear. "Carter, you are in violation of direct orders and emergency protocols. You will answer for every second of this unauthorized response." Emily's response was broadcast to the entire base. "I won't answer to anyone until this child is safe. You can write up whatever reports you want after that." The boy in her arms was in worse condition than she'd initially thought. His lips were blue, his breathing shallow and irregular. When she checked his pulse, her training kicked in. This was severe shock, possibly internal bleeding. His name tag read Sam Henderson. "Come on, Sam," she whispered, opening her emergency medical kit. "Stay with me." She'd trained for this exact scenario during her weekend volunteer work with civilian emergency services. Work she'd pursued on her own time and money because the military wouldn't give her the chance. Those hundreds of hours of unpaid training were about to save a life. As she worked to stabilize Sam's airway and wrap him in thermal blankets, Emily was acutely aware of the fuel fumes making her dizzy and the very real possibility that one spark could turn the entire area into an inferno. But her hands remained steady, moving with practiced precision. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was filming from behind a fuel truck, later telling reporters, "I watched her through my camera lens. She was scared. You could see it in her clenched jaw, the way she kept glancing at the fuel spill. But she never stopped working, not for a second." 20 minutes into the rescue, Sam began having mild seizures. His small body convulsed in Emily's arms as his condition worsened. She administered glucose from her personal medical supplies and continued monitoring his vitals. But she needed real medical backup. "Where's the medical team?" She called out to the personnel gathered at the safety perimeter. "They're following protocol," someone shouted back. Waiting for the all-clear from hazmat, Emily felt a surge of anger mixed with disbelief. While trained medics waited for permission, she was watching a child slip away. The hypocrisy was staggering. She'd been deemed unqualified for emergency response. Yet she was the only one actually responding to the emergency. Lieutenant Pierce's voice cut through the air again. "All personnel are witnessing a civilian employee defying direct orders and endangering herself and others. Military police are en route to handle this discipline situation." Emily ignored him, focusing entirely on Sam. His color was improving slightly, and his breathing had stabilized, but he was still unconscious. She made detailed notes on her clipboard, documenting every intervention for the medical team that would eventually take over. What she didn't know was that an aircraft carrying the highest-ranking officer in the region had just made an unscheduled early landing. General Michael Henderson's plane wasn't supposed to arrive for another 2 hours, but weather conditions had forced a change in flight plans. As his plane taxied to a stop, Henderson could see the commotion on runway 3 through his window. Crowds of personnel at the perimeter, emergency vehicles positioned at a distance, and one unauthorized truck positioned dangerously close to the fuel leak with a lone figure working frantically in the back. "Sir, we have a discipline situation," Major Williams briefed him as they prepared to disembark. A civilian technician violated direct orders to attempt an unauthorized rescue. Lieutenant Pierce has the situation contained and is preparing to file charges. Henderson studied the scene more carefully. The person in the truck was completely focused on their patient, oblivious to the chaos around them. Their positioning showed tactical thinking, close enough for immediate care, positioned for quick evacuation if necessary. "Contained?" Henderson asked quietly, a tone in his voice that made Major Williams nervous. The general stepped off his plane and walked directly toward the crowd, his focus entirely on the small drama playing out where someone was willing to risk everything to save a life. Lieutenant Pierce stood at rigid attention as General Henderson approached, clearly expecting commendation for maintaining order during what he saw as a dangerous breach of protocol. "General, sir, I've contained the situation. The civilian contractor will face appropriate disciplinary action for endangering personnel and violating emergency protocols." Henderson didn't acknowledge the salute. His attention was fixed on Emily, who was still working over the child in her truck, completely absorbed in keeping him alive. "What's the current status of the injured party?" Henderson asked Captain Martinez, the medical officer who'd accompanied him from Washington. Martinez had been watching Emily work through binoculars. "Sir, the child was in critical condition when this began. Based on what I've observed, if that technician hadn't provided immediate first aid in those first 5 minutes, the boy wouldn't have survived. She's performing advanced trauma care with skills that exceed most of our enlisted medics." Henderson processed this information, then raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Who authorized the prohibition of rescue vehicles in this situation?" Pierce stepped forward, his confidence beginning to waver. "I did, sir. Standard operating procedure for fuel leak scenarios requires maintaining safe perimeter until hazmat teams assess the situation." "And where was your medical response team during this time?" Pierce hesitated, and Henderson could see the exact moment the lieutenant realized his mistake. "Sir, they were following standard protocol, waiting for the all-clear signal." Henderson studied the scene with 30 years of combat experience. He could see the tactical precision of Emily's positioning, the way she'd minimize risk while maximizing her ability to save a life. This wasn't recklessness. This was intelligent courage. "So while your medical team was following protocol," Henderson said slowly, his voice carrying across the tarmac, "this civilian technician was saving a life." An uncomfortable silence settled over the crowd. Some of the younger officers were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Henderson approached Emily's truck, where she was checking Sam's pulse and making notes. "Miss Carter?" "Yes, sir." She looked up briefly, saw the stars on his uniform, and immediately returned attention to the child. "With respect, sir, I can't salute right now. This boy needs constant monitoring, and I think he might be coming around." Henderson was struck by her priorities. No apologies, no attempts to justify her actions, just a clear statement about what mattered most. "How did you know what medical equipment to have available?" he asked. Emily finally met his eyes directly. "I maintain all the emergency vehicles on base, sir, including the decommissioned ones. I kept this truck running because I believed someday it might save someone's life. I also trained with civilian emergency services on weekends. I wanted to be ready if something like this ever happened." Henderson felt something click in his mind. He looked more closely at the child, really examining him for the first time. The boy had distinctive features, and when Henderson gently checked the medical alert bracelet on his wrist, he read a name that stopped him cold. "Samuel David." "Henderson," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily looked confused. "Sir, do you know him?" Henderson's voice became very quiet. "This child, he's my great-nephew. His grandfather was Lieutenant David Henderson, my wingman. We flew together in Iraq and Afghanistan until he was killed in action 3 years ago, saving a convoy of civilians." The crowd watched in stunned silence as the 3-star general knelt beside Emily's truck and placed his hand gently on Sam's forehead. The boy's eyes fluttered open for the first time since the accident. Henderson looked directly at Emily. David died saving other people's children. Today, you saved his son. Lieutenant Pierce stood frozen, realizing that his contained situation had just become something entirely different. The woman he'd been preparing to discipline had just saved the life of a general's family member, and had done it while his own medical team waited for permission. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone on that tarmac knew it. 3 days after the rescue, Emily was back in her workshop, trying to return to normal routine. But nothing felt normal anymore. Word of her actions had spread throughout the base, and she found herself the center of attention she'd never wanted. "Carter, you've got visitors," Rodriguez called from the doorway. Emily looked up to see Captain Martinez approaching with a clipboard and a serious expression. Behind him was Master Sergeant Patricia Williams, the base's senior enlisted advisor. "Miss Carter, I'm here to conduct a formal review of the incident on runway 3, Martinez said. "This is standard procedure for any emergency response that deviates from established protocol." Emily wiped her hands on a rag and nodded. "I understand." "Walk me through your decision-making process," Martinez said, pen poised over his clipboard. "At what point did you decide to disregard Lieutenant Pierce's orders?" Emily had been dreading this question, but she'd had 3 days to think about her answer. "Captain, I've been turned down for emergency response training 4 times in 8 years. Every time, I was told I lacked battlefield experience. But I've spent those 8 years preparing anyway, because I believe that preparation might matter someday. That doesn't answer my question about disobeying direct orders. When I saw that child, I made a choice. I could follow orders and watch him die, or I could use my training to save him. It wasn't really a choice at all." Master Sergeant Williams stepped forward. "Ms. Carter, what you did was brave, but it could have endangered other personnel. What if the fuel had ignited?" Emily met her gaze steadily. "Ma'am, I positioned my vehicle to minimize that risk. I've studied emergency response protocols for years. I knew exactly how much danger I was in, and I accepted that risk." What Emily didn't know was that this wasn't just a routine review. General Henderson had quietly ordered a comprehensive investigation into the base's emergency response procedures. Captain Martinez was documenting everything, but not for the disciplinary action everyone expected. "Tell me about your medical training," Martinez continued. "I have civilian EMT certification, advanced first aid, trauma response training, and 200 hours of volunteer service with county emergency services. All completed on my own time and at my own expense." Martinez made detailed notes. "And Lieutenant Pierce was aware of your qualifications. He knew I had some medical training. I don't think he knew the extent of it. Why didn't you apply for transfer to medical services?" Emily's frustration finally showed. "Captain, I've applied for every emergency response position available. I've been told repeatedly that my civilian training doesn't count as real experience. So I stayed in maintenance and kept preparing anyway." Meanwhile, across the base, Lieutenant Pierce was having his own interview with the base commander, Colonel Thompson. It wasn't going well. "Lieutenant, explain to me why you prohibited medical response to a child in critical condition," Thompson said. Pierce shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, protocol clearly states that fuel leak scenarios require. I'm familiar with the protocol. What I want to know is why you didn't adapt when the situation changed. We had a qualified person willing to take action, and you stopped her." "She's not qualified, sir. She's just a maintenance technician." Thompson slid a folder across his desk. "This is Emily Carter's personnel file. MT certification, pilot's license, 200 hours emergency medical volunteer service, and 8 years of exemplary service on this base. Tell me again how she's not qualified." Pierce opened the file and felt his stomach drop. He'd never bothered to look at Emily's full qualifications. In his mind, she was just the obsessive mechanic who worked too many hours. Sir, I wasn't aware of the extent of her training. That's the problem, Lieutenant. You made command decisions based on assumptions rather than facts. While you were worried about protocol, she was saving a life. The interview continued for another hour, with Pierce's explanations sounding weaker with each question. Thompson was building a case, but not the one Pierce expected. But back in her workshop, Emily was finishing her interview with Captain Martinez when General Henderson appeared in the doorway. Miss Carter, may I have a word? Martinez and Williams immediately stood at attention. We'll finish this later, Martinez sighed, gathering his papers. When they were alone, Henderson looked around Emily's workshop, taking in the meticulously maintained equipment and the decommissioned ambulance truck that had saved his great-nephew's life. I wanted to thank you personally, he said. Sam is going to make a full recovery because of what you did. I'm glad he's okay, sir. How is he doing? He's asking about the lady who helped him. He wants to meet you properly when he's feeling better. Emily smiled for the first time in days. I'd like that. Henderson was quiet for a moment, then said, I've been in the military for 30 years, and I've learned that sometimes the most important decisions happen in the seconds when there's no time to consult the manual. You made the right choice. Lieutenant Pierce doesn't seem to agree. Henderson's expression hardened slightly. Lieutenant Pierce is learning that good leadership means adapting to circumstances, not just following procedures. That's a lesson some officers never learn. Emily sensed there was more to this conversation than a simple thank you. Sir, is there something else? There's going to be some changes around here, Ms. Carter. Changes that recognize the value of people who are prepared to act when action is needed. I think you'll find them interesting. As Henderson left, Emily felt a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She'd spent 8 years fighting for recognition, and now it seemed like things might finally change. But she'd learned not to get her hopes up too high. She turned back to her work, not knowing that her actions had already set in motion changes that would transform emergency response protocols throughout the entire Air Force system. 2 weeks after the rescue, Emily noticed something unusual happening around the base. Young airmen were stopping by her workshop, asking questions about emergency medical procedures. Senior technicians were requesting copies of her equipment maintenance schedules. Most surprisingly, Colonel Thompson had quietly assigned her 3 junior technicians to help with expanded emergency preparedness duties. What's really going on? Emily asked Rodriguez when he brought the latest batch of volunteers to her workshop. Rodriguez grinned. Word is that General Henderson has been making phone calls, big ones, to the Pentagon. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. What kind of phone calls? The kind where 3-star generals ask pointed questions about why talented people get overlooked because they don't fit the traditional mold. Before Emily could respond, Master Sergeant Williams appeared in the workshop doorway. Carter, you're needed in the briefing room. Now, Emily's heart sank. This was it. The formal disciplinary hearing she'd been dreading. She'd saved a life, but she'd also violated direct orders. The military had a way of making examples of people who colored outside the lines, regardless of the outcome. The briefing room was packed with more people than Emily had expected. Colonel Thompson sat at the head of the table, flanked by Captain Martinez and other senior officers. Lieutenant Pierce sat to one side, looking distinctly uncomfortable. General Henderson was present via video conference from the Pentagon. Ms. Carter, please be seated, Colonel Thompson said formally. Emily took the indicated chair, her hands folded in her lap. She'd prepared herself for this moment, but the presence of so many senior officers was intimidating. We've completed our investigation into the events of March 15th, Thompson began. Captain Martinez, please present your findings. Martinez stood and opened a thick folder. After extensive review, we found that Miss Carter's actions, while Technically in violation of direct orders, were medically sound, tactically intelligent, and ultimately life-saving. Her positioning minimized risk while maximizing effectiveness. Her medical interventions were appropriate and expertly executed. Emily blinked in surprise. This wasn't what she'd expected. Martinez continued. Furthermore, our investigation revealed significant gaps in our emergency response protocols. Ms. Carter possessed qualifications and training that were not properly documented in our personnel systems, and these capabilities were not being utilized effectively. Colonel Thompson took over. Lieutenant Pierce, your handling of this situation has been reviewed as well. While your concern for safety was appropriate, your rigid adherence to protocol without consideration for changing circumstances showed poor judgment. You'll be attending additional leadership training focused on adaptive decision-making. Pierce's face flushed red, but he said nothing. Thompson turned to Emily. Miss Carter, your actions raise important questions about how we identify and utilize talent within our organization. You've been maintaining critical equipment and training for emergency response for years. Yet, you were never formally incorporated into our emergency protocols. General Henderson's voice came through the video connection, which is why we're implementing immediate changes. Emily's pulse quickened. Changes could mean anything. Effective immediately. Henderson continued. You're being promoted to technical sergeant and assigned as head of emergency vehicle maintenance for the entire base. Additionally, we're establishing a new rapid response protocol based on your improvised procedures from March 15th. Emily felt the room spin slightly. Sir, I don't understand. It's being called the Carter Protocol, Thompson explained with a slight smile. Mobile emergency response procedures for situations where traditional protocols prove inadequate. You'll be training personnel across the base in these procedures. But sir, I'm not military personnel. I can't be promoted to technical sergeant. Henderson's voice carried a hint of amusement. You can if you're willing to enlist. Your civilian experience will count toward your rank, and your demonstrated leadership qualifies you for immediate NCO status. Emily sat in stunned silence. After 8 years of fighting for recognition, she was being offered everything she'd ever wanted and more. There's one more thing, Henderson added. The Pentagon is reviewing emergency response protocols across all bases. Your actions have highlighted deficiencies in how we handle non-standard situations. There's going to be a service-wide policy review. Lieutenant Pierce finally spoke up. Sir, with respect, doesn't this set a dangerous precedent? If personnel can simply disregard orders when they disagree. Henderson's voice cut him off sharply. Lieutenant, there's a difference between disagreeing with orders and recognizing when rigid adherence to protocol will cost lives. Good leaders know the difference. That's why you'll be attending that leadership training. Emily found her voice. Sir, I need time to think about this. It's a big decision. Of course, Thompson said. Take all the time you need. But I hope you'll consider it. We need more people who understand that serving others sometimes means serving people instead of just serving systems. As the meeting broke up, Rodriguez approached Emily outside the briefing room. So, Sergeant Carter, how does it feel to completely turn this place upside down? Emily shook her head, still processing everything. Rodriguez, 3 weeks ago, I was just a mechanic who worked too many hours. Now, they want me to rewrite Air Force emergency protocols. Maybe that's exactly what the Air Force needs, he said. Someone who cares more about saving lives than covering their ass. Emily looked back at the briefing room, where senior officers were still discussing the changes her actions had set in motion. For the first time in 8 years, she felt like she might actually belong here. But she also understood that accepting this opportunity would mean taking responsibility for changing not just her own career, but potentially the culture of an entire organization. It was a bigger challenge than she'd ever imagined, but also exactly what she'd been preparing for all along. The official ceremony was scheduled for the following Friday, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was building to her head. Lieutenant Pierce had been unusually quiet since the briefing, and she'd noticed him having hushed conversations with a few of the other officers who'd been critical of her actions. On Thursday afternoon, Emily was in her workshop training 2 young airmen on emergency equipment protocols when Pierce appeared in the doorway. His posture was rigid, his expression hostile. "Airman, you're dismissed," he said sharply. The 2 young men looked at Emily uncertainly. She nodded toward the door. "We'll continue this tomorrow." When they were alone, Pierce stepped into the workshop and closed the door behind him. "We need to talk." "About what, Lieutenant?" "About the fact that you've turned this entire base upside down with your little stunt." Pierce's voice was tight with anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Emily felt her own temper rising, but she kept her voice level. "I saved a child's life. You undermined military authority. You made me look like a fool in front of senior officers, and now they're changing decades of proven protocols because of one incident. One incident where your protocols would have let a child die." Pierce stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? The mechanic who saved the day. But what you really are is a civilian contractor who got lucky and is now being rewarded for insubordination." Emily had dealt with Pierce's condescension for months, but this was different. This was personal, angry, and potentially dangerous to her career. "Lieutenant, I think you should leave." "I'm not finished," Pierce snapped. "You want to know what I really think? I think you're a wannabe who's been playing dress-up for 8 years, pretending to be something you're not. And now, because you happen to save the general's nephew, everyone's acting like you're some kind of military genius." Emily felt something cold settle in her chest. Is that what this is really about? That Sam was related to General Henderson? Don't act naive. If that had been some random contractor's kid, you'd be facing a court-martial right now instead of a promotion ceremony. You're wrong, am I? Let me tell you what's really going to happen here. This whole Carter Protocol nonsense will last about 6 months until the next inspection cycle. Then things will go back to normal, and you'll go back to being what you've always been, a mechanic who doesn't know her place. Emily stood up slowly, her hands steady despite the anger building inside her. My place is wherever I can help people. That's what I've been doing for 8 years, and it's what I'll keep doing regardless of what you think. Pierce's expression turned ugly. We'll see about that. I've been documenting every irregularity in your work, every time you've overstepped your authority. One mistake, Carter. One single mistake, and I'll have you off this base so fast. Lieutenant Pierce. The voice from the doorway was quiet but carried absolute authority. Both Emily and Pierce turned to see General Henderson standing in the entrance to the workshop. Neither of them had heard him approach. "Sir," Pierce snapped to attention, his face draining of color. Henderson stepped into the workshop, his eyes moving between Pierce and Emily. "I was hoping to speak with Miss Carter about tomorrow's ceremony, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation." Pierce's throat worked as he tried to find words. "Sir, you were just what, Lieutenant? Threatening a civilian contractor? Questioning command decisions? Or perhaps explaining how you plan to document irregularities in the work of someone who just saved a child's life? Sir." Pierce's voice trailed off. Henderson's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "Lieutenant, in 30 years of military service, I've learned to recognize several types of officers. There are those who lead by example, those who follow orders effectively, and those who understand that true leadership sometimes requires adapting to circumstances." Pierce stood frozen at attention. Then there are officers who confuse authority with leadership, who mistake rigid adherence to procedure for competence, and who see challenges to their ego as threats to military order. Henderson's eyes fixed on Pierce. "Which type of officer do you want to be?" Emily watched the exchange with fascination. Henderson wasn't shouting or threatening. He was simply asking a question that cut to the heart of everything. "I want to be an effective leader, sir," Pierce managed. "Then I suggest you start by understanding what effective leadership actually looks like." Miss Carter saw a child in danger and took action to save him. She used her training, her equipment, and her judgment to preserve life when following standard procedure would have cost it. That's not insubordination. That's leadership. Henderson turned to Emily. "Miss Carter, would you excuse us? I need to have a private conversation with Lieutenant Pierce about his future as an officer." Emily nodded and headed for the door, but Henderson's voice stopped her. "And Miss Carter?" "What Lieutenant Pierce said about Sam being my nephew, he's wrong about that mattering. I've read the reports. Your actions were tactically sound, medically appropriate, and morally necessary. The family connection just made it personal for me. But even if Sam had been a complete stranger, what you did was exactly what we should expect from someone with your training and character." As Emily left the workshop, she could hear Henderson's voice continuing in the same calm, measured tone. But she didn't envy Pierce the conversation he was about to have. For the first time since the rescue, Emily felt truly confident that she'd made the right choice. Not just in saving Sam, but in standing up for what she believed in, even when it meant challenging authority. Tomorrow's ceremony would make it official, but the real victory had just happened in her workshop, when a 3-star general had made it clear that courage and competence mattered more than rank and rigid protocol. The old Emily would have been satisfied with that vindication. But the new Emily, the one who was about to become technical, Sergeant Carter, was already thinking about how to use this opportunity to make sure other qualified people didn't have to fight for 8 years to be recognized. Change was coming to Maxwell Air Force Base, and Emily was going to be at the center of it. The promotion ceremony took place on a crisp Friday morning in the main hangar, with what seemed like half the base in attendance. Emily stood at attention in her new uniform, feeling both proud and slightly surreal. After 8 years as a civilian contractor, she was officially Technical Sergeant Emily Carter, NCO, and head of Emergency Response Vehicle Maintenance. General Henderson conducted the ceremony personally, having flown in from Washington specifically for the event. As he pinned the chevrons on Emily's uniform, he spoke loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. "Today we recognize not just exceptional service, but exceptional character. Technical Sergeant Carter represents the best of what our military should be. People who are prepared to act when action is needed, who serve others before themselves, and who understand that our highest duty is to preserve life." The applause was thunderous. Emily could see Rodriguez grinning from the crowd, along with dozens of airmen she'd trained over the years. Even some of the officers who'd been skeptical of her promotion were clapping respectfully. Lieutenant Pierce was notably absent. After the ceremony, Colonel Thompson approached Emily with a folder. "Your first official assignment, Sergeant. The Pentagon wants a complete review of emergency response protocols at all Air Force installations. You'll be leading a team to develop new standards based on your experience." Emily opened the folder and felt her breath catch. The scope was enormous: dozens of bases, thousands of personnel, and the opportunity to reshape how the Air Force handled emergency situations. "Sir, this is ... this is huge. It's also necessary. Your actions proved that our current system has significant gaps. We need someone who understands both the technical and human sides of emergency response to fix those gaps. When do I start?" Thompson smiled. "You already have. The team is being assembled now, and you'll have full authority to implement changes as you see fit, Within reason, of course. As the crowd dispersed, Emily found herself standing alone in the hangar, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. 8 years of fighting for recognition had led to this moment, not just personal vindication, but the chance to ensure that others wouldn't face the same barriers she had. And Emily. She turned to see Sam Henderson running toward her, followed by a woman who had to be his mother. The boy looked completely recovered, his cheeks pink with health and excitement. "Sam, how are you feeling?" "I'm great. Mom says you saved my life." He looked up at her with the kind of hero worship that made Emily's chest tight with emotion. Sam's mother, Jessica Henderson, extended her hand. "I'm Jess. I've been wanting to thank you properly, but Sam insisted on waiting until you got your promotion. He's a smart kid. He wants to be a mechanic when he grows up. Says he wants to help people like you do." Emily knelt down to Sam's level. "Being a mechanic is great, but you can help people in lots of ways. The important thing is to be ready when someone needs help." "Like you were ready for me?" "Exactly like that." As the Henderson family left, Emily was approached by a young airman she didn't recognize. "Sergeant Carter?" "I'm Airman Martinez. I was wondering if you might have time to talk about emergency medical training. I've been trying to get into the program for 2 years, but I keep getting told I need more experience." Emily smiled, recognizing the frustration in the young woman's voice. "Let me guess. They say you need battlefield experience." "Exactly. Well, Aaron Martinez, I think I can help you with that. Report to my workshop Monday morning. We're going to be doing things differently around here." Over the next hour, Emily was approached by nearly a dozen personnel with similar stories, qualified people who'd been overlooked, dismissed, or told they didn't fit the standard mold. Each conversation reinforced her understanding of how much work lay ahead. As the sun set over Maxwell Air Force Base, Emily stood in her workshop, looking at the emergency truck that had started everything. The vehicle looked the same, but everything else had changed. A radio crackled to life. "Sergeant Carter, this is Control Tower. We've got a situation developing on the south runway. Medical emergency, possible cardiac event. Can you respond?" Emily felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, but this time it was different. This time, she was officially authorized to help. This time, she wouldn't have to choose between following orders and saving lives. "Control Tower, Technical Sergeant. Carter responding. Emergency vehicle en route." She climbed into her truck, turned on the emergency lights, and headed toward the runway. But this time, she wasn't driving alone into uncertainty. She was driving with the full backing of her command, leading a team she'd trained, implementing protocols she'd helped design. As she raced toward the emergency, Emily's radio crackled with coordinated responses from multiple units, all following the Carter protocol she'd developed. The old system would have had everyone waiting for authorization. The new system had them moving to save lives. It was exactly what she'd spent 8 years preparing for. 6 months later, Emily stood in a Pentagon briefing room, presenting the results of her Air Force-wide emergency response review to a room full of senior officers. The statistics on the screen behind her told a story of transformation. Since implementing the modified protocols across all installations, we've seen a 40% improvement in emergency response times and a 60% increase in successful outcomes for critical medical situations, she reported. More importantly, we've identified and utilized qualified personnel who were previously overlooked by our standard screening processes. General Henderson nodded approvingly from the front row. "Sergeant Carter, how many bases have fully implemented the new protocols?" "All 147 domestic installations, sir, with overseas bases scheduled for completion by year's end. We've also trained over 3,000 personnel in advanced emergency response procedures." "And the resistance you mentioned in your preliminary reports?" Emily allowed herself a small smile. Minimal, sir. Turns out most people support policies that save lives and recognize talent regardless of traditional career paths. After the briefing, Emily walked through the corridors of the Pentagon with a sense of surreal accomplishment. The girl who'd been told she lacked battlefield experience was now shaping policy for the entire Air Force. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Rodriguez. Saw you on the Air Force News Channel. Sam Henderson is at the base today for a school visit. Kid's still telling everyone he wants to be a mechanic like his Aunt Emily. Emily smiled, remembering the scared little boy she'd pulled from that helicopter. Now he was healthy, happy, and inspiring other kids to think about helping people. Another message came in, this one from Airman Martinez. Sergeant, just wanted you to know I passed my emergency medical certification. First in my class. Thanks for believing in me when nobody else would. That message meant more to Emily than all the Pentagon briefings combined. She was changing lives, one person at a time, just like someone had done for her by giving her this opportunity. Her final message of the day was from an unexpected source, Lieutenant Pierce, who was now stationed at a base in Colorado. Sergeant Carter, I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about our conversation 6 months ago. You were right about leadership meaning more than just following protocols. I'm working on being the kind of officer who adapts when circumstances require it. Thank you for the lesson. Emily stared at that message for a long time. Pierce had been her biggest opponent, but even he had learned from what happened. Change was possible for everyone, if they were willing to embrace it. That evening, Emily sat in her quarters at Maxwell Air Force Base, looking at the framed photograph on her desk, herself working over Sam in the back of her emergency truck, completely focused on saving a life. General Henderson had given her the photo after her promotion with a simple inscription, Technical Sergeant Emily Carter, acting when others await orders. But next to it was a newer photo that meant just as much to her, a group shot of her emergency response team, 24. Men and women from diverse backgrounds, all united by their commitment to being ready when help was needed. Her laptop chimed with an email from the Air Force Chief of Staff. Sergeant Carter, your success with emergency response protocols has caught attention at the highest levels. The Secretary of Defense is interested in discussing how your approach might apply to other service branches. Would you be available for a meeting next month? Emily read the email twice, then leaned back in her chair. A year ago, she'd been a civilian contractor fighting for basic recognition. Now, she was being asked to advise the Secretary of Defense. But what struck her most wasn't how far she'd come, it was how far the system had come. The military was learning to recognize and utilize talent wherever it existed, to value results over rigid protocol, and to understand that the best way to serve the mission was to serve the people who carried it out. A radio crackled with a familiar voice. Sergeant Carter, this is Rodriguez. We've got a situation brewing in Hangar 7. New civilian contractor. Thinks she knows better than everyone else about maintaining equipment. Sound familiar? Emily laughed and reached for her radio. On my way. Let's go see if we can help another dreamer turn into a leader. As she walked across the base toward Hangar 7, Emily reflected on how completely her world had changed. She'd started as someone fighting for the right to help. Now she was someone empowering others to do the same. The old emergency truck still sat in her workshop, maintained and ready. But now it was just one vehicle in a fleet of properly equipped emergency response units, operated by trained personnel who understood that their highest duty was to preserve life. Emily Carter had proven that one person, properly prepared and willing to act, could save more than just a single life. She could save an entire system, transforming it from the inside out through the simple revolutionary act of putting human needs before bureaucratic procedures. The most important rules she'd learned really weren't written in operations manuals. They were written in the human heart, and they said simply, when someone needs help, and you have the ability to provide that help, you help them. Period. That wasn't insubordination. That wasn't recklessness. That was humanity at its finest, the willingness to risk everything for someone else's tomorrow. And in a world that often seemed to value systems over people, Emily Carter had reminded everyone that the greatest act of service was knowing when to serve people instead of serving systems. The base needed more people who understood that distinction. Fortunately, Emily was now in a position to find them, train them, and make sure they never had to fight for 8 years to be heard. As she approached Hangar 7, Emily could hear raised voices, someone arguing about proper procedures, someone else insisting that regulations are regulations. It sounded exactly like her own fights had sounded a year ago. Emily smiled and quickened her pace. She had work to do. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.